want to introduce our next speaker so we can keep things moving along here. Our next speaker is Alyssa Palmer. Alyssa is a graduate student here at Utah State University. She's working on a system for raspberry production adapted to Utah, and she's been working not just here on campus with her research, but she's had plots scattered all over the state. So she's put a lot of miles in dealing with that. And so Alyssa, I will turn it over to you. And we'll, again, coming up after her, we'll have a break and an extended question and answer. So Alyssa, take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. Like you said, I'm Alyssa Palmer. I'm a graduate student. I've been working on this project for a couple of years now. Excuse me. So just to give you an overview of what I'll be talking about today, we'll be going over just some basic management practices for raspberries. And then I will discuss some of the research we've done on how to address some of the challenges that we experience in Utah's climate when it comes to growing red raspberries. Let's see. Sorry, I think my screen froze for a second. There we go. So just quickly for those of you that don't know, red raspberries have a perennial root system and biennial cane growth. So they have floricanes, which are the second year's growth, and primicanes, which are the current year's growth. And the primicanes develop while the floricanes are producing fruit. So with raspberries, there are two different types. We have summer bearers, which produce fruit on the floricanes, our second year's growth, and then the fall or the ever bearers produce fruit on primicanes. So the summer bearers, as I mentioned before, they produce fruit on the floricanes. They produce a single summer crop, usually in June, and at the end of the season, you'll remove all the spent canes and narrow and thin the rows. And with fall bearers or ever bearers, usually produce a late summer or a fall crop, but they also have the potential to produce 2 crops a year. So if you're going for a single fall crop, you'll prune all the canes to the ground at the end of the production season. Or for a double crop, you'll prune below just the last flower cluster. And then you'll expect just a smaller fall crop during your production season. So you'll have a summer crop and then a smaller fall crop. So in Utah, we do experience some challenges due to our short growing seasons and harsh winter conditions. With summer bearers, we see winter injury on the floricanes, which reduces the yield. And then with fall bearers, we have an issue of the yields being later than our first hard freeze in the fall. So a couple of solutions we have to address this would be using high tunnels and low tunnels. And I'll talk about those a little more in a minute. Or we can select cold hardy summer bearers or early fruiting fall bearers that are suitable to Utah's climate. So this is a trial that was conducted in Kaysville on summer bearing varieties. So this table to the left shows the percentage of survival rates of floricanes. And then the table to the right shows the average yields for each of those years and then the mean total. And if you look at these two tables, we see that the varieties that had the higher rate of floricane survival also produced more raspberries. So that very much highly correlates with our yield. And then when we look at these bottom varieties, I forgot to mention that the higher on the table you are, the higher the survival rate, the lower on the table, the lower the survival rate. And so we see with these bottom 4 varieties that they had a much lower yield, and which correlated with the lower survival rate of floricanes. This is another trial that was conducted on fall bearing varieties. And these two figures are two different trials. So if we were to look at the left graph here, those bars show the yield, the highest yield. And then the little dash marks on each of these bars show our worst case scenario, so the lowest yield that we received throughout those years. And if we look at Poca, oh, and also just to mention, going left to right on this graph, we see the earlier fruiting varieties on the left, and then to the right is the later fruiting varieties. And Poca had a fairly high yield, and also when we had our harder years, it still did not dip too much below. So Poca generally was our most consistent variety. And if we look at Joanne J, it had a very high yield, much higher than Poca. However, when we had a harder year with lower yields, it tended to be almost half of what our highest yield was. So it wasn't very consistent. But when we look at this other variety trial that was conducted in 2013 and 2014, this just shows the mean yield of the raspberries, and our top 4 varieties are here at the top. Joanne J and Polana, Autumn Bliss had the highest yields. So there are a couple of approaches that we can use for growing raspberries, fall bearing varieties in specifically. So the first way we've done it is we've used high tunnels, which are just a low cost PVC frame structure. Generally, they're somewhere about 14 feet wide, and they can range from all kind of lengths. This tunnel in particular that we studied was about 100 feet long, but we cover them with plastic. And then with low tunnels, we just use like a wire or a metal hoop and cover it with either remake cloth or a perforated plastic. And so these have been used to protect raspberries in the fall so that they can continue to fruit past the first fall freeze. And then we also have used them to push our production early with early fall bearing varieties. And then again, we can use low tunnels similarly, and we've also used them within high tunnels for more protection and more heat. So this is a study that was conducted in 2016 and 2017 on 2 fall bearing varieties using high tunnels. And if we were to look at these tables to the right, it shows both years, both varieties, Caroline, Josephine, sorry. And then to these little, this column to the right shows the difference between the tunnel and the field of when the harvest started. So as you can see, with Caroline, the harvest consistently started 26 days earlier in the tunnel than it did in the field. And then with Josephine, it was roughly 20 days between the tunnel and the field. And then this bottom table shows the season midpoint. And again, quite a bit earlier in the tunnel than in the field. And for additional information on these trials that I just talked about, you can go to berry.usu.edu. So as Dr. Black mentioned before, I've been traveling throughout Utah and testing soil heating on various sites throughout Utah. And we've been using low tunnels. And what we have found is that the low tunnels have advanced the primary cane growth and the final cane height of the raspberries. However, the past 2 years that I've done this, the results varied a little bit with yield. So in 2020, the plants under the low tunnels did fruit about 10 days earlier than those in the field. And that was pretty consistent across the board. I did this research in Washington County, Cache County, and in Utah County. And in 2021, we didn't see a huge difference between the two, between the field and in the low tunnels. At the beginning, we did see faster cane growth. However, just due to that early heat wave, everything tended to fruit about the same time. So the next thing that I want to discuss is the variety trials of fall bearing varieties that we did at USU Greenville's farm. And in this trial, we did use a high tunnel and low tunnels. This is just some information about the cultivars. This is what we knew prior to conducting this study. Poke, as you can see in some of the research that I just talked about, it has been studied in the past, but it's a variety that was developed in Poland, well known for its high productivity and quality fruit. It's also fairly winter hardy. BP1 is a cross of Poca and another variety, Tulamine. It was developed in Italy. Again, it has really large and high quality fruit. Kweli, Amara, and pima are all varieties that were developed in the Netherlands and known for having high quality fruit and very large fruit. And then these two other numbered varieties were developed in Oregon, released by the USDA in 2020. Again, similar expectations for that one as well. So we planted the first four varieties, BP1, Poca, Kweli, and Amara in 2018. And then we planted the last three varieties in spring 2020, so pima and the two Oregon varieties. You'll see as I'm presenting some of this data that we don't have the data for 2019 and 2020 on these ones. And then in 2021, we installed a high tunnel, a low-cost PVC framed high tunnel. And then we placed the plastic covering in March and then removed it in May when it started to get too hot. And then we also installed some indoor low tunnels using Rime cloth just for some extra heat and frost protection. And then in May, when we removed the plastic, we installed the shade cloth just to prevent that sunburn on the fruit. So this is our yield for 2021, comparing all of the varieties that we tested. So we harvest the berries 3 times a week, and this is the yield, total yield. And then that number to the side is just for reference in acres, according to our row spacing. This table shows the yield for each of the years and the average, and then we also have our marketable percentages for each of the years. Poca consistently had a very high yield, and then it also had a fairly high marketable percentage, the average over the 3 years, 89%, which is pretty good. And then ORUS, ORUS 4291, our Oregon variety, had a very low yield. Although it says it did have a high marketable percentage, this yield was pretty small. And then this table shows our 20% yield benchmark and our 50% yield benchmark. So 20% of our total yield throughout the season and 50%. We look at Poca again. It reached the 20% yield benchmark earlier than all the varieties those first 2 years, and then also reached the benchmark earlier, the 50% yield benchmark earlier than the other varieties. But then when we tested the other 3 varieties this year, we did see that they all had a fairly early yield, reaching both of those benchmarks in August. However, again, these yields weren't very high compared to Poca. So, and then this table is showing our fruit quality. So we've got our average fruit size, the average visual score, and then soluble solids, that refers to the sugar content of the berry juice. So when we look at this, BP1 had the highest sugar content, one of the highest average fruit sizes, and a very high visual score. And then pima was actually our largest fruit. They produce very, very beautiful fruit. If you can look at the bottom right corner, we see our pima. It was very nice looking fruit. However, it just didn't have a very high sugar content. This table shows the results from surveys that were collected this past fall. We set up a little booth at the farmers market in Kaysville. In 2 separate weeks, we had consumers / participants rank each of the cultivars based on how much they like them and also how much they were appealing to them. So when we look at the 2 weeks, we see that BP1 and Poca were the most popular among consumers, according to taste and according to visual appeal score. And then Amara and our Oregon variety was not as popular with consumers. And then this, I just want to summarize some of these varieties that we do recommend after conducting this research. So Poca would be the first one we'd recommend. Overall, it was the most reliable cultivar. It did produce the second earliest yield, but it did also produce the highest yield, quite a bit higher than the other varieties. And then it was a favorite among consumers, according to flavor and visual appeal. And the berries, while not being the largest, they were a decent size and were high quality. BP1 we also would recommend just due to having nice large fruit. It had very high visual scores. The sugar content was also very high, making it also the most popular among consumers. And it did have earlier yields than some of the other varieties, while not being the earliest. And then it did have a moderate sized yield. The pima we would also recommend due to it having nice large fruit, had a very high visual scores. And then it did have earlier yields than a lot of the varieties as well, and it had a moderate sized yield. Although it did have a lower sugar content and it wasn't as preferable among consumers, it was still ranked above average. So, and then with kweli, we did experience some large yields with kweli. That's why we would recommend it. Large fruit, it had, again, very high visual scores. It is moderately preferable to consumers. Wasn't a favorite, but consumers still liked it. And then the yields were later than what we would, and what would be ideal for our growing season. But we can push for an earlier yield using a high tunnel. And these are the varieties that we don't recommend. While all of these varieties had some good qualities to them, unfortunately, the bad qualities outweighed the good. With Amara, the yields were too late. We did have very low sugar content and it had a very low flavor preference among our consumers. With the 2 Oregon varieties, again, they had smaller yields. The berry sizes were very small for both of these and had low visual scores. And then I just want to thank my major professor, Brent Black, and our farm technician, James Frisbee. And then just to note that we have fact sheets available at www.berry.usu.edu. And we will also be putting out a fact sheet fairly soon about the variety trials that I just discussed. So look forward to that. And thank you.
Thank you, Alyssa, for that great information. There was a comment that came up about Joan Jay. And I don't know how experienced you are with that when you mentioned it during the variety trials from Kaysville. I'll just add on that. Joan Jay's a nice one. One of the things that we found with it, with consumer preferences, is the fruit tends to be a little bit darker than some of the others, and some consumers didn't like that. They thought it looked overripe, but it's a really productive variety. We didn't include it here because we didn't have space and we were looking at trying to push some really, really early varieties. One question for you though, Alyssa, is on the pruning. When did you prune and how did you prune your raspberries in this trial?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we pruned these around November, December. We generally wait until the canes have gone dormant to prune. From what I know, you can prune in the late fall or in the early spring before they start growing. So
okay. And that you were doing just fall production. So you talked about pruning fall bears for a double crop versus a single crop. And I assume these were pruned for a single crop, correct?
yeah, we prune them just for the single crops. We prune them all the way to the ground.
Okay. Let's see. I haven't been watching the questions. It says there's someone commented here that Joan Jay, they usually mow them down in February. Let's see. Am I missing some questions? Let's see. Oh, where do you find varieties like BP1? Alyssa, do you know where those are sourced?
I'm not 100% sure on BP1.
Okay, yeah, that's a newer variety. If you're looking for any specific variety and sources, my favorite place to go is the Cornell nursery website. So if you do Cornell University has a small fruit nursery website, and they list every variety that's commercially available and which nurseries carry that specific variety. So it's listed either by variety or by nursery, and it's a great source for finding it. I believe the BP1 we got through Norse Farms, Nourse, Norse Farms in Massachusetts. They carry it. I'm not sure who else carries it, but that's where we got our variety. So that's a good question. It's a newer variety, and you know, the thing that's interesting about it is it's got that earliness from Polka and really that fantastic fruit quality that we see in Tulamine, and Tulamine's just not hardy to our environment. So the question's coming. Another question is, are there local nurseries that carry the raspberry plants? There probably are. I don't, for our purposes, we're looking at very specific varieties, and so we typically do a mail order situation. And there are some, again, that Cornell website has the cross reference to nurseries, and a lot of those nurseries will do mail order even in small quantities. I'm sure local nurseries will carry raspberries. Whether or not they carry these specific varieties, I don't know. And maybe Alyssa, you've looked at that.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure about the local nurseries. I know that I've looked into it a little bit just from people that know me that have asked. And I know that we haven't been able to find Polka locally, but yeah, I haven't looked into a lot of the other varieties.
My experience is a lot of the local nurseries carry the old standbys, the heritage, the for the fall bears, and maybe can be in some of the older varieties. But our results show that some of these newer fall bears are just a lot earlier and more productive in our environment. I have seen Caroline carried by some local nurseries. Other questions? We have just a couple more minutes before we go to break. Here's a good one. How many years are raspberry plants productive, and when do we recommend replacing them? Do you want to take a stab at that one, Alyssa?
Yeah. I want to say it's 5 to 7 years. As far as taking them out before they're not productive. Would you agree with that, Brent?
Yeah, so that's a good point. And it depends a little bit on varieties. I know some varieties kind of run out of gas after about 5 to 7 years. I've heard of people keeping them for 20 years, but I've never seen, once you get past 8 or 10 years, I've never seen those plantings be as productive. I would say one cautionary tale is that how long you keep it depends on how well you can keep it healthy, and that includes weed management. So oftentimes I've seen 3 and 4 year old plantings that probably should be taken out because the perennial weeds got out of control. But if you can keep the weeds under control, I think that's probably the right range. And again, some varieties tend to run out of gas faster than others in terms of the productivity and fruit size dropping off. So that's a good question.